In this video, we're going to talk about how to find roots by hand. So zeros, roots, and x-intercepts all refer to the place where the graph crosses the x-axis. Linear equations will always have one zero or one root or one x-intercept. Quadratic equations that have an x squared term can have 0, 1, or 2 roots. Usually they have 2. Sometimes they have 0, sometimes they have 1, but normally they have 2 roots. All right, steps to find 0 by hand. First, you need to plug in 0 for f of x or y, and then you need to solve for x. So the first question, it says find a 0 of the function f of x equals 2/3 x minus 8. So my first step is to plug in 0 for f of x, and I have 2/3 x minus 8. So I'm going to solve this for x. Add 8 to both sides, and I have 8 equals 2/3 x, and then I'm going to multiply through by the reciprocal of 2/3, which would be 3/2. So 8 times 3/2 gives me 24/2 is equal to x, and 24/2 is equal to 12. So the root of the linear function f of x equals 2/3 x minus 8 would be 12. Example number 2, what are the x-intercepts of y equals 2x squared minus 34? So again, I'm going to plug in 0 for y, so 0 equals 2x squared minus 34. This is a good candidate for a question that can be solved using square roots because I have an x term and a constant and I do not have a linear term. So I can add 34 to both sides. And when I add 34 to both sides, I end up with 34 equals 2x squared. I want to solve that for x squared, so I'm going to divide both sides by 17. No, wrong. I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I'm going to get 17. So I have 17 is equal to x squared. And then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And when I take the square root of 17, excuse me, I get 4.123 approximately is equal to x. And then don't forget, you also have to include both the positive and the negative roots. So your answer is going to be plus or minus 4.123. Example 3. What are the roots of 4x squared minus 9 equals 35x? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that, or I'm going to plug in 0 for y. So I have 4x squared minus 9 equals 35x plus 0. And then I'm going to put this into standard form, so I'm going to subtract 35x from both sides. So I have 4x squared minus 35x minus 9 equals 0. This would probably be a relatively easy equation to solve by factoring. So I'm going to multiply 4 and negative 9, and I get negative 36. I need 2 factors of negative 36 that add up to be negative 35. Those are going to be negative 36 and 1. So I'm going to have 4x squared minus 36x plus x minus 9 equal to 0. Group these, and then I'm going to factor by grouping. So the greatest common factor here is going to be 4x, so I'm going to factor out of 4x, and I'm left with x minus 9 plus greatest common factor here is 1, so I'm going to factor 1, and then I'm left with x minus 9 equals 0. So my two factors are 4x plus 1 and x minus 9 equal to 0. So I have 4x plus 1 equals 0, and x minus 9 equals 0. So if I solve this equation, I'm going to end up with x equals negative 1/4. Solve this equation, I end up with x equals 9. So the two roots are negative 1/4 and 9. Last example is a word problem. Suppose you threw a baseball into the air with an initial upward velocity of 29 feet per second from an initial height of 6 feet. The formula h equals negative 16t squared plus 29t plus 6 gives the ball's height in feet, h, at time t seconds. How long will it take for the ball to hit the ground? So, when I hit the ground, my height is 0. So I'm going to plug in 0 for h. 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 29t plus 6. This is probably not one that I'm going to be able to solve by factoring, or at least not quickly. I'm not recognizing factors right away. So I'm going to go ahead and use the quadratic formula in order to solve this. It's already set up nice neatly for me. So I have a is equal to negative 16, b is equal to 29, and c is equal to 6. So I can plug this into the quadratic formula. X equals negative b, or negative 29, plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is 29 squared, minus 4 times a, which is negative 16, times c, which is 6, all over 2 times a, which is negative 16. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit. 29 squared is going to be 841. So I have negative 29 plus or minus square root of 841. 4 times 16 times 6 gives me 384, and it's going to be positive, since I have a negative times a negative, all over negative 32. Add the 841 and the 384 together, and I get negative 29 plus or minus the square root of 1,225 all over negative 32. I can take the square root of this, so I end up with negative 29 plus or minus the square root, oops, sorry, it's not square root anymore, it's just going to be plus or minus 35 from when you take the square root. I'm missing my white out here. So I'm going to have negative 29 plus or minus 35 divided by negative 32. So negative 29 plus 35 gives me 6 over negative 32. Negative 29 minus 35 gives me negative 64 over negative 32. So 6 divided by negative 32, 6 divided by negative 32 gives me negative 0.19 approximately, and 64 negative divided by 32 negative gives me 2 positive. Of these two answers, only one of them makes sense. You can't have negative time. We're not going to go backwards in time. So the only answer that makes sense is going to be the 2 for 2 seconds. Again, you can't have negative time, so make sure you pick the positive root in this case.